Hi, good afternoon if you're on the East Coast, and good morning if you're out west. My name is Aaron Lacey, and you are listening to Protecting the Ever-Increasing Endpoints in Higher Education, our latest webinar in our higher education webinar series brought to you by the law firm of Thompson Coburn. We are delighted that you are tuning in today. I will start off here briefly with some of our housekeeping as we do for every one of these webinars. First of all, you've probably noted that you have a number of widgets at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions during the webcast, please feel free to submit them through the Q&A widget, and we're going to try to answer these questions during the webcast to the extent we can, but to provide a fuller answer at the end. A copy of today's slide deck is available in the resource widget, so if you want the slides, please be sure to go download them. That having been said, if you forget to do it and you think about it down the road, you can always shoot us an email and we're happy to send them to you. You can find additional answers to some common technical questions issued are located in the help widget there at the bottom of the screen. And then finally, if you're a lawyer type, like some of the presenters today, this webinar is CLE accredited, so that's continuing legal education accredited in California and Illinois for an hour of general CLE credit, and in Missouri for 1.2. We always like to give a little more credit here in the state of Missouri, and then in Texas for 1 general credit. And that is pending, but we expect it's forthcoming. We award CLE based on attendance for the entire 60 minutes, so please do make sure that you are in attendance for that entire period. From time to time, you'll be required to click a little pop-up screen that comes up just to confirm your continued engagement. And your CLE certificate will be emailed to you later this afternoon once the good producers here at Thompson Coburn have had a chance to verify your attendance. The last thing I'll note is we do have a post-webinar survey, and I say this every time, and I could not be any more sincere. We encourage you and deeply appreciate if you take the time to fill out the survey. Let us know your thoughts. We really do try to make every webinar better than the one before. So Thompson Coburn, just briefly, occasionally we'll get folks who've not listened in to these series before. We are a law firm, and a pretty big one. We have working on about 400 attorneys these days. We're headquartered in St. Louis, but we have offices all over the place: Chicago, Los Angeles, Dallas, DC, some of those big cities. And we have a higher education practice that provides legal counsel, compliance, training, all kinds of services to colleges and universities. And here's a picture of some of the beautiful people that either are part of and work full-time with our institutions of higher education or work with them on occasion. And one of those folks actually, Jim Shreve, is one of the big players today, as well as Luke, actually, Sosnicki. Speaking of which, we'll get to those presenter profiles in just a minute. But before we do, I do want to highlight that this, again, is part of our Higher Ed webinar series. The first one was offered back on September 28th. It's already available. All of our webinars that we do as part of this series are posted after the fact, and they are free and on demand. So if you don't catch one and you want to listen to it at a later date, you're welcome to do so. If you want to go back and listen to the one about the Department of Education's new distance ed rule, again, it is now available, and you can just click on that link right there. I'll also highlight that coming up in November, we are going to do a live video. We have a great panel. We've got some folks from ACE and NICU, some of our own in-house higher ed lobbyists, and they're going to be doing a debriefing on the elections and what they mean for higher education. So please put November 12th on your calendar. I think that's going to be a really nice presentation. And then at the end of the year, as I often do, I'll be back probably along with Katie and a couple others doing a year-end roundup of the U.S. Department of Education's rulemaking activity. And some of you know this year we've seen a lot of rules go into effect as of July 1. So we'll be talking about some of that and some of the other things we've seen. So today we've got a great panel for you. We have 4 people actually who are going to be presenting, not including myself. I'm going to get out of the way here in just a second, but we've got Katie Wendel, who's counsel in our higher education practice and works extensively with institutions of higher ed, especially on regulatory issues, transactional issues, things along those lines, and also has worked with a number of our institutions on cybersecurity matters in concert with a couple other people. One of them is Jim Shreve, who's the partner and chair of our cybersecurity practice, and we are always delighted to work with Jim on issues. He also, I'll note, and he may talk about this a little bit later on, but has actually been serving on a task force advising the U.S. Department of Education as they think about new cybersecurity rules or policies for the regulated community. So Jim, again, manages cybersecurity matters for lots of different industries, but has done, in particular, a lot with our higher education clients, and actually, like I said, is working with the department. In addition to Jim, Luke Sosnicki, as one of our litigators from our California office, so out on the West Coast, has found his way into a number of data security and cybersecurity issues over the years, and you may have already seen some of Luke's content he regularly writes and presents, in particular on the CCPA. So some of you may know the folks out in California have been creating regulatory challenges and new issues for people across the country and around the world. And Luke, in particular, has a lot of expertise and depth on that CCPA law. And then finally, I'm so pleased to introduce Ben Auton. Ben, did I say your last name right? Is it Auton or Auton? Do you prefer the French pronunciation?
No, just Auton. It's been Anglicized.
Auton.
Yeah.
Auton it is. Well, so Ben is here with me in St. Louis. We're both in the Midwest, so Auton it is. If you're listening and you're in France right now, you can always choose Auton. Ben is a Midwesterner. He's the Vice President of Operations and Security Services with SpearTip, which is a company that is based in the Midwest, works all around the country, and does a tremendous amount of cybersecurity work and helps folks in various industries, including higher education, develop effective cybersecurity frameworks and strategy for their organization. Our law firm has had the opportunity to work with and speak with folks from SpearTip before. And Ben, we are just so delighted that you are able to be here and to join the presentation because we know you got a lot of great content to offer. So with all of that being said, I'm going to close out my little part here until the end when I'll pop back on and maybe help out with moderating some questions. I'm going to hand the reins over to Jim. And Jim, if you would, take us through the syllabus and into the presentation.
Well, thanks very much, Aaron. And thanks to all of our speakers and to all of you for attending today. I think this is going to be some really useful information for everyone. Occasionally kind of scary information, but useful nonetheless. So we're going to start out and talk about what are some of the attacks we've seen cyber-wise on the higher education environment, and then kind of looking into how things have changed for everyone, but particularly in higher education since the start of the year with everything that's been going on. And then as a result of that new learning and working environment that we're all operating in, what are some of the security controls that are more important now to counter some of these new threats, some of these increased threats that we're seeing in certain areas. Then Katie's going to go through some of the legal and regulatory issues for higher education. What are some of these legal and regulatory standards that everybody has to comply with in the cyber and privacy space? And then I'll talk a little bit about my involvement with the U.S. Department of Education is holding this longstanding cyber initiative, and I've been lucky enough to be involved in that. And I'll describe some of what's gone on in there so far, how it currently stands and where that may eventually lead. My colleague Luke will go into some of the litigation risks, particular to cyber and privacy for higher education. And then we'll each give a few closing thoughts and address any questions that we weren't able to take so far. So with that, I'll pass it off to Katie to go over what we've seen in higher ed attack-wise.
Great. Thank you so much, Jim. Hi, everyone. Very happy to be here with you today. So in June of this year, we learned through trade press that cyber criminals successfully targeted several colleges and universities using ransom tactics that were relatively new to the higher ed landscape. I thought it would be fun, you can picture my air quotes there, to walk through a few recent examples of cyber attacks in higher education. So the criminals steal sensitive information and then threaten to share it on the dark web unless a bounty is paid. Sounds like maybe a bad story in a movie that you might watch on Netflix these days, but it's also really happening in schools. So I highlighted here on the slide several schools that were successfully targeted, including Michigan State, UC San Francisco, Columbia College Chicago, and the College of the Desert. They were each targeted using malicious software known as NetWalker and then given a deadline of 6 days to pay. So NetWalker then boasted on its blog and Twitter feed that it had social security numbers, passport numbers, banking details, and other sensitive information from students and employees at the schools. Michigan State stated publicly that it would not pay the ransom, which was an unusual thing to do. Most schools don't make their response to ransom demands public, but MSU said that they reached this decision in accordance with law enforcement guidance and support from the university's board of trustees and president. So something kind of interesting to think about. You know, they have to get buy-in across all aspects of the university when something like this happens. And they had to provide continuous updates to all students, faculty, and staff. Those populations were understandably concerned about what information of theirs had been stolen. At Michigan State, the attack was limited to a couple of departments, and the school worked with those individuals affected to provide identity theft protection services, so it was kind of limited there, which helped them. Also, an interesting note from the schools on this list, UC San Francisco is one of the research institutions leading efforts in the U.S. to find possible treatments for COVID-19. So several media reports suggested that this research and potentially lucrative associated IP may have made the school an attractive target for hackers. The university hasn't confirmed the target of the attack and never released confirmation of whether they paid the ransom or not, but their information was never found on the dark web by reporters, so we assume that they figured out a solution there. College of the Desert is a community college in California, and they experienced a malware attack that took down their school's website and email right as classes were starting this fall semester online. So the school was able to set up a temporary website in the meantime and the semester as planned, but of course it added a lot of headaches to the situation, not to mention the cost the school unexpected money and time. I also want to note that ransomware attacks have already evolved in the higher ed sphere. Last year, there were attacks where the hackers would block access to computer networks and files, which was a huge hassle and embarrassment and could be expensive to recreate. In response to those attacks, more schools have invested in systems to back up their data. So if access to information is blocked, the data isn't lost. But hackers, realized that they had blocked that, so now they've changed tactics and steal personal information and hold that for ransom. In September of 2019, Montgomery College was the victim of an internet fraud scheme that diverted a $2.8 million payment from the college to a fraudulent bank account. They have worked with law enforcement and have since recovered a portion of that money, but a total of $1.7 million was still lost, not to mention the time and energy dedicated to the attack. A lot of extra strain results from these attacks when people are not on campus, which is the case for most schools right now. So students and faculty are relying on the school's network to attend their classes and be part of the campus community. It really makes messaging and de-escalation of these problems even more difficult for school administrators. Finally, I wanted to mention this idea of Zoom bombing. And this is when outsiders get access to online class sessions and disrupt the class, either for fun or for nefarious reasons. Schools have reported that tests have been canceled and classes have been postponed or ruined because of these hackers. They've disrupted classes to show pornographic images or videos, racist content, and lots of really other disturbing stuff. So this is something that schools have adapted to, but again, hacking will just continue to evolve as faculty and IT staff learn how to manage it. So it's just another endpoint that schools now have to be more mindful of than ever. So with those quick examples, I want to turn it over to Jim and Ben to talk about our new post-secondary online environment.
Well, thanks, Katie. And before we leave this slide, just one other thing I'd like to mention here is a lot of what we see here on the slide goes to direct attacks on institutions. But quite often the attack won't come directly at you. It may go through your service providers. And one attack I'd like to call out because it's been an issue for many institutions, not just in higher ed, but a lot of nonprofits as well, is an incident Blackbaud. Blackbaud hosts databases for a lot of entities, particularly in the fundraising space, and they had a pretty high-profile security incident earlier this year, and it's noteworthy because it shows that you've got to think about all the things that have been an issue for a while still are an issue. This wasn't particular to the new working environment, but it shows that it's you still have to think about all the old things as well. And so, in the Blackbaud incident, originally it looked like it was a lot of sensitive information was not exposed, but it's since come out that in certain circumstances, things like Social Security numbers were accessible. So keep an eye on that, and keep an eye on your service providers, because they may be the way that somebody gets access to your systems, gets access to your information. So we talked a little bit about, it's a whole new situation, and I don't need to tell any of you about this. You're experiencing it every day. The operations are different. We have remote learning, for sort of the front side of the house for in higher education, where students are have for a while now been accessing remotely a lot of these systems, but now quite often in a lot of situations it's exclusively online, and so you have a lot more students accessing the systems remotely than you had before, or students who didn't previously access it remotely. Professors are having to get used to giving lessons, doing classes from their home environment, and so now they are accessing in a way that is remote that they previously weren't. And on the back of the house, you have administrative employees that used to always access the systems from in the office, just like in a lot of settings, are doing that from home, and sometimes from their own devices. So it's a different environment, and what that has resulted in is a lot more of what we call endpoints. And so, Ben, what is an endpoint? Because that's in the title of today's presentation. What is it, and what does that mean?
Yeah, absolutely. So an endpoint is really anything with an operating system. So most people will think of their laptop, maybe it's a Mac or Windows, but there's all sorts of new endpoints that are also impacting environment, in particular higher education. So those also include things like tablets, like an iPad or an Android device. Chromebooks are very pervasive in the education environment. So really any device that has an operating system that's letting you, access the internet and access files and do different applications and of that nature.
Thanks, Ben. So based on this different environment, so we're working remotely, we have some different exposures, and things that are now a greater issue than they used to be. And so, there's a few of them on here. Phishing, to start off with. Phishing's been an issue for a long time, but just to make it more concrete, I've seen reports that phishing attacks, email-based attacks, have increased 67% since the start of 2020. I've certainly also seen a great increase in what are often called smishing attacks, SM, referring to text-based. So just like a phishing email, but it's coming to you through text messaging rather than through an email. Ben, what have you seen in the nature of phishing attacks this year?
Yeah, one of the things we really noticed from the incident response practice at SpearTip, where we were responding to these events, is that although a lot of higher education institutions were doing social engineering based training to try and help people not click on malicious phishing emails or click on otherwise bad links and Word documents, as soon as everyone switched to more of that remote model, it almost changed their environment. So they were working out of their home office, and a lot of that training was degraded in a sense. Just all the changes rapidly that occurred in 2020 have really made people forget a lot of that training and have made these social engineering attacks like phishing more effective.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things I would mention with regard to phishing before we move on to the next one is, just given the time of year, I think it's a good time for a reminder to think about W-2 phishing attacks because there's a spike in these at the beginning of every year. First quarter of every year, there's a big spike in people out there trying to use phishing attacks to obtain access to W-2s on employees when those are sent out at the end of January generally. Keep that in mind, especially in the remote environment, because quite often what you'd have when everyone's in the office, somebody gets a phishing email related to W-2s, it seems a little suspicious. They'll walk down the hall to the person that is purportedly sent it to say, hey, did you just send this to me? When you're remote, you may have to do something, what we call out of band, to verify the email. Can be a little harder. But the phone is your friend. Pick up, if you get something suspicious, pick up the phone, call someone to see if they actually sent it. Because we're going to see a lot of those kind of phishing emails in the first quarter of next year. Next one we have on the list, ransomware. Katie mentioned a lot of ransomware attacks. There's been explosive growth in ransomware in the last 2 or 3 years. There are estimates that since the beginning of 2020, we've seen ransomware attacks increase by 72%. I'd note that the Department of Education's Federal Student Aid Office issued a technology service alert on September 1st, particularly talking about ransomware that's targeting educational institutions. That alert gives some points on prevention and detection, and it urges notice to the Department of Education if you've been targeted. I do think it's a little plug for lawyers. It's good to talk to your lawyers before you necessarily do that, or have a strategy for when you're going to talk to your regulator. I do think there's some useful information in there, and I'd urge everyone to take a look at it. Ben, I'm sure you must have just incredible stories about ransomware attacks, particularly in the last year.
Yeah, absolutely. And as some of those examples of specific universities at earlier in the presentation show, the tactic this year has really changed. In the previous cyber world, you would have data breaches where someone was after collecting personal information or otherwise embarrassing information inside an environment. And then you would have the other types of extortion, which would be encrypting files so that they were unusable unless you paid for a key to unlock them. And we've seen those attack types really come together this year, where these threat actors and groups are both stealing sensitive data and also encrypting and locking down environments. Some of these attacks have gotten really brutal, where if you reboot the system, it actually damages what's called a master boot record, so it renders the system unusable until you reimage it. And just because of the data theft associated with that, it's enabled these threat groups to get more aggressive on what they encrypt and how they encrypt, because you have two motives to pay. Even if you can't recover your data, you usually want to prevent your personal information from being released or otherwise sensitive information being released on the public internet. We see the ransom demands increasing because of these, sophisticated types of attacks. The one that we're showing on the slide is a ransom demand from Doppelpaymer, which is a very pervasive threat group. And this was actually targeting, a school system. So the school system was hit with the ransom demand of just under $400,000. And really what is driving this is the fact that these attacks have become more manual. So they'll get inside your environment through some sort of phishing email. Maybe your managed service provider, as Jim said earlier in the presentation. Once they're there, they'll actually stick around for quite a while. So in some cases, they're there for a couple of weeks. In some cases, it could be months. They'll collect data. They'll get additional access. They'll target backup solutions. And then normally it's Friday or Saturday night. They'll go ahead and disable the environment. And it's really hard to underestimate just how paralyzing this can be, especially for a higher education institution, given the fact that there's such a dependence on technology and there's so many functions inside a university or college, from the business office to the faculty to residential areas that can be affected by these attacks.
Yeah, excellent, Ben. So, I think one thing the classic ransomware attack, where it used to be that ransomware was a shotgun approach, and so you'd send out the same basic attack to a lot of entities. It would be designed to get on the system and find data, encrypt it, and then and try and collect a ransom. And the old idea was that we anticipate you might be able to recover this data from your backup files, but we're going to make the ransom low enough that it's just worth your while to pay it. So then you don't have the hassle of trying to do this. But now, as Ben noted, we're seeing much more targeted attacks with ransom amounts that are much higher. How else would you say, Ben, that the nature of the attacks and the targets of the attacks have changed, say, in the last year or so?
Yeah, in the last year or so, we used to see, mainly a handful of industries affected by those attacks where, the financial sector was targeted, or maybe the healthcare sector even to a degree, especially with private information. But really at this point, almost everyone's a target, is what I like to tell people. It's the fact that, even higher education institutions have cyber insurance. They have, they have something to lose based on a business disruption. And the bad actors are going to exploit that fact, regardless of what the business type is or even how large the institution is. It really ranges in size as well.
Excellent. The next thing we have identity theft, which isn't a new thing at all. But in the new environment where you have a lot more places, a lot more endpoints to secure, and a lot more places from which you could potentially take the data, identity theft comes back as a more real increased risk to entities and to people associated with them, whether it's students or faculty or administrators. And I would also note that I've certainly seen people tend to be a little more stretched in the current environment. And there's a lot more juggling going on. And one of the best ways you can help with identity theft is to constantly be monitoring your risk, the individual to be monitoring their risk. And a lot of people just haven't had the time to do that in the new environment. And so what typically before might have been picked up is not necessarily being picked up. Ben, any thoughts on identity theft lately?
Yeah, especially for higher education, I would just say that you might have more sensitive data than you would think. Some of the obvious is, social security numbers and data related to applicants and financial aid. But we actually had a recent case where a rather large university system, had health clinics on campus, and the clinic was leveraging a personal Dropbox to store, a bunch of medical records from visits and different things. And that ended up, being compromised. And it was kind of surprising to university leadership, just the amount of records that were there, how old they were. And so I just kind of offer that up that, in a higher education environment, you may actually have more data just given the mission of universities than you would first think.
Yeah, and that dovetails into the last point we have here, theft of IP. There's a lot of focus, rightly paid, to personal information that institutions may hold, but quite oftentimes certain actors are much more interested in non-personal information that an entity may have, whether that's intellectual property or other non-personal information. Certainly, universities, there's a lot of research going on. The FBI, had recently provided a notice about the hackers from the People's Republic of China targeting COVID research institutions. And they released 2 indictments along these lines in July. I would note that it's not only China that's doing this, and I would note that they're not only targeting COVID research. But Ben, do you have thoughts there?
Yeah, absolutely. In the past, we've seen different research sectors in the economy get targeted, from agricultural to technology, by nation states in order to actually steal intellectual property to benefit, those nations' corporations and, be more competitive in general. But we've really seen over the last, probably 18 months to 2 years, this become more of an issue for higher education institutions. In particular, the ones who may be doing research related to DoD projects. In those types of cases, you may even have some obligations under DFARS, just depending on the nature of the data that you're working with, and what, systems or networks, the research department might be accessing. And we've seen this just because universities are a very open environment. They're very internationally oriented, but occasionally that brings the problem of some sort of insider threat that is actually taking, intellectual property or research data for a nefarious purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. And Ben, you mentioned about DFARS. I think when you're, particularly for legal and compliance people, when you're involved in something with Department of Defense research, and so you're subject to the DFAR requirements, that when we're talking about a security incident, it's defined differently and much more broadly than, say, under the state breach notice laws, or even under requirements you may have under HIPAA. It's looking to, do you have an actual or possible access to some of the protected information, or the systems on which that information may reside or pass through. And furthermore, the timing of the notice requirements that you have to give to the Department of Defense is very short. Being in a position to give them notice within 72 hours can be quite a task. So I think good to think about that in advance for how you may have to deal with those incidents somewhat differently. So with all these risks, what are some of the controls that you can put into place? Where we have so many more people accessing systems from so many more different devices. And just start off with something everybody's familiar with: passwords. Passwords since the beginning of system access have been used and are still one of the primary ways to secure systems. What are some important things to do with your passwords? I think one is complexity. Having complex or really even better, longer passwords. If you're not able to use password keepers and generate passwords that way, then it's good to maybe consider going to passphrases, which can be very long, and if you do the math on it, it's much harder to crack a passphrase that might be 25 characters long, but easily memorable by someone. My cat is named Barrister, is easy for me to remember and is much longer than if I just used the term barrister. Another important point with passwords is make sure that they're not being reused across different platforms. There was a security incident at LinkedIn. Everybody knows LinkedIn. That was years ago. That resulted in a lot of usernames and passwords being available on the dark web, and it's just amazing to me that you're still seeing attacks that use those LinkedIn credentials that are being reused on other platforms, and they still work. Now years down the line, it shows that you need to be changing passwords, but have a policy against using passwords on the system that you're using other places. Ben, thoughts on passwords?
Yeah, passwords have become, so pervasive in dumps and in different ways of compromising them that it is really important to focus on it. And just making those passwords longer, we would recommend anything, 12 characters and above, just based on what we're seeing is really important.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Another source out there, the FTC. Many of you are familiar with the FTC in the Gramm-Leach-Bliley space. So, in the context of your student aid, for which Katie's going to talk a little bit about under Gramm-Leach-Bliley. But they also have general enforcement authority to go after entities that aren't employing reasonable security. And they produce a lot of guides and resources. And in 2017, they had this series called Stick with Security. It was kind of best practices used on many different areas. And they had something on passwords and authentication that they released in August of 2017 that I think is good for both. It's a little basic maybe for some of the technical people, but it's a really good use item for the non-technical people on passwords and some of the things you can do in that space. So carrying on, so multi-factor authentication. So multi-factor authentication, often called MFA, is using more than one factor for authenticating someone from multiple categories of factors. The classic ones being something you know, something you have, and something you are. Something you know might be a password. Something you have, by far the most often that is your phone, but it can be other things too. And something you are, that's generally a biometric type of identifier. And so employing multi-factor authentication says you use maybe somebody's phone in combination with a username and password to authenticate them when they're logging in. It's been a big issue in the financial services sector. There was a guidance on this from 2001. But one thing I'd particularly note here is you may be familiar with the FTC's proposed revisions to the safeguards rule. And it does have requirements around the use of multi-factor authentication, and specifically would note that under the proposed more stringent safeguards rule, requires financial institutions to implement multi-factor authentication for any individual accessing customer information. Multi-factor authentication requires individual accessing your networks that contain customer information unless your CISO has approved in writing other secure access controls. So this is definitely something that may become a hard and fast regulatory requirement, at least in certain parts of your organization. Then from the security side, thoughts about multi-factor authentication.
Yeah, it will just really solve a lot of issues, if you're considering implementing it across your environment. We especially recommend this for email authentication. There is a little bit of disruption to a user that they have to set up, another factor. Maybe it's, 6 numbers they have to put in or even a text message, which is a little bit less ideal. But, if you're considering that for your environment, I would just highly encourage it. It will go a long way to protect, your email and other systems, even if you're trying to weigh the user convenience that it might impact.
Okay. So those are, in some ways, I think, more basic issues. There are some newer issues, some more technical issues that come up in the context of controls. Ben, do you want to walk us through a few of those?
Yeah, absolutely. And these are really designed for higher education institutions and just some of the challenges they face. And one of the key differences I really feel for this space and industry is that you have different network requirements within a college or a university system. You have your administration, which looks similar to, a business where there's, business applications and processing of data and support services and all of those different IT functions. But then you also have a faculty group, which has very specific needs. You have a student group that may be, students in the classroom or in a lab. And then you also have a group of, residential users. And all of these user types really make the different requirements for those groups complex. So one of the key recommendations that we would have for a university environment is to really properly segment those networks. You don't want your residential networks able to talk to, administrative systems. And as separated as possible between some of those is usually ideal. And that will help you increase security on some of the more sensitive data that might be located on administrative servers while allowing, the network and usage to remain open in places like residence halls, or, a student union or a place like that. And it helps you balance those different requirements. If your network's very flat and everything can talk to these different environments, you're usually exposing some of your more sensitive data or, mission critical data to unnecessary risk. And then, just looking, oh, sorry, go ahead, Jim.
No, please continue.
Okay. Yeah, so looking down the list too, for the BYOD security, one of the things we find really important for academic institutions is wireless network access control devices. What this will allow you to do is just identify these different devices that are connecting to your network. If you don't have one, it is difficult to identify, if a student brings an infected laptop onto your network, who's using the laptop, where is it located, how can we segment it, or even go, respond to that particular user. And then mobile device managers really help with leveraging, university-owned systems in the field where you can push secure configurations, you can make sure that the devices are up to date and compliant. So just a big recommendation for managing when people are leveraging their own devices and still connecting it to those networks that may have, important data or administrative data on it. And then video sharing has become increasingly pervasive in the academic space, as well as others. And we just really recommend for Zoom or any major application that you put some controls to try and help regulate who is actually accessing them. One of the key recommendations is just to make sure that when people are logging on to the video sharing application, that they have to authenticate in some way. They have to give their user, a name, an email, and authenticate. That way, if you have problems, you're able to, identify the user who may be causing those problems and restrict their access to the video sharing application.
Excellent. Thanks, Ben. Katie, you want to go through what are some of the legal frameworks for higher education in this space?
All right. Thanks, Jim and Ben. We thought it made sense to briefly go over how a school is legally obligated to maintain their cybersecurity. And this is an area that is ever evolving, of course, and we'll hear from Jim on the U.S. Department of Education's initiatives on this front momentarily. So the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, which I will call GLBA from here on out, establishes cybersecurity requirements for financial institutions. And as an initial matter, post-secondary institutions are considered financial institutions per the GLBA. So the School Program Participation Agreement, also known as their PPA, which is the agreement a school signs with the Department of Education, along with the Student Aid Internet Gateway Agreement, or the SAIG agreement that Title IV schools must sign, require that schools have the GLBA cybersecurity safeguards in place. If a school doesn't follow GLBA, it may be found administratively incapable, which could result in a myriad of consequences, including even loss of Title IV eligibility. So you do have to submit evidence of compliance with GLBA for your institution's annual student aid compliance audit. Briefly, I know we're kind of getting tight on time, but GLBA requires that schools develop, implement, and maintain a documented data security program. They have to designate a specific employee to coordinate that program. And that doesn't have to be their only job, but that does have to be a part of their job specifically. They need to identify reasonably foreseeable internal and external risks to data security via a formally documented risk assessment of all these things, including your employee training and management, your information systems, networks, software design, information processing, storage, transmission, and even disposal, which is kind of a common finding, records disposal and transmission, or record keeping and disposal. And then the ability to detect, prevent, and respond to attacks. So this includes implementing physical and technical safeguards like firewalls. You have to limit access to secure areas of the system and in the physical facilities with passcodes and security cards, and make sure that only staff and employees and even vendors have, they need to have a legitimate need to have access to those materials. So then the big thing is that you have the plan, you test and monitor the plan for effectiveness, and update it every time it needs an update, and that it's not secure anymore. So as we've discussed, it's ever evolving, so that happens a lot. The other thing is that schools are responsible for their vendors. So you need to oversee the service providers that you use for all of this cyber work, and that number of vendors is increasing as schools move more things online and have students working from home. So you need to take reasonable steps to choose and retain providers that are capable of maintaining appropriate safeguards for the federal student aid information and student and school information at issue, and then require your service providers through your agreement with them to implement and maintain those documents, those safeguards. So finally, you need to evaluate and adjust your school's data security program in light of all that. And I want to point out that while I hope this is something that most schools have already done, it is high time to reevaluate, especially now that the systems and operations have changed so much in the face of the pandemic. Title IV schools are also subject to the requirements of the Federal Trade Commission Identity Theft Red Flags Rule, which I believe Jim mentioned earlier, which requires the school to develop and implement a written identity theft prevention program. which should detect, prevent, and respond to patterns, practices, or specific activities that may indicate identity theft. So what is a breach? A breach of cybersecurity is an unauthorized disclosure, misuse, alteration, destruction, or other compromise of information. So an example of that could be human error combined with auto transmission system error, where 5 students receive the educational record information of another student's financial aid. We also had recently a school I was working with that they had somebody trying to hack in and make charges on a student's account, and they made $1 charges over and over and over again to test that out, and luckily the school was on top of it and caught it, but that's an example of a potential breach. So the department, your SAG agreement with the department specifies a duty to report any actual and suspected breaches, and I want to make sure it's clear that you're obligated to report those breaches on the day it is detected or suspected. And the department does have specific instructions for how to report those. And I do want to add that ideally you have this plan for how you deal with a breach in place before the breach occurs. And the first step in that plan really should be a call legal counsel, whether that's your in-house or outside counsel. You'll want them to be a part of the process, and your conversations with them will be protected. So that's an important note. And a big part of thinking through this plan is limiting who's involved in knowing what's going on until you have a plan to move forward and know what you should do. I will briefly touch on FERPA and HIPAA here. So FERPA is a federal law that protects the privacy of student education records, and the law applies to all schools that receive funds from the U.S. Department of Ed. A school is obligated to notify students annually of their rights under FERPA. The school can choose how they do that, and a covered school just cannot disclose a protected student's records without a release from that student. There are several allowable record disclosures that you can disclose those records without consent to certain categories of parties or under certain circumstances. I won't go through all of them, but they include other school officials with a legitimate educational interest in the student's record, other schools when the student is going to transfer, which has become more of an issue as students, make moves during this pandemic and now that they're at home. A licensing agency, when a student wants to get a license to become a nurse, you need to be able to disclose their student record. And officials in the case of a health or safety emergency, which is also something that has been coming up more and more, in particular in the middle of a worldwide pandemic. A school can publish directory information, so name, address, telephone number, date and place of birth, honors and awards, and dates of attendance. But a school does have to give notice and allow a reasonable amount of time for a student to request that directory information is not released. And that hold, if they choose to hold that information, stays even after that student is no longer at the school. Common violations under FERPA are just especially related to third parties. As I mentioned, schools are responsible for their third parties and vendors and their compliance with these rules. And they are also responsible for their compliance with FERPA. So a school can be held liable for something, and that's something to verify upfront that you have these safeguards in check with your vendors, and then regularly check up on that. Record destruction, as I mentioned, is another thing that causes issues, as well as online non-directory information, and even some directory information, which has been inadvertently released on social media now that is so prevalent for schools and students. And people are really sensitive about this. Google search people, and then all of a sudden you can connect the dots about some private information by finding things that have been put online. So which brings up some special considerations for schools with respect to FERPA now that so much traditional education is being held online right now. There are no FERPA violations in sharing classroom videos or recorded audio discussions with only the students who are in the video or audio recording of a class. However, an advance announcement that the session will be recorded should always be made to allow students to self-select out of camera or audio if they don't want to be a part of that recording. Recordings of classes from prior semesters that you might be tempted to use now for classes, they require FERPA compliance through use of consents from any identifiable students, or you need to edit those students out of video. To mitigate the risk of students not knowing what is or is not protected by FERPA, we just recommend that instructors include language in the syllabus regarding expectations that the instructor's written consent is required before students can capture classroom lectures on their own and record them, and that they can't copy or share the instructor's classroom recordings with anyone who is not enrolled in the class. So, for example, students should not even be sharing the recordings with their parents if other students are identifiable in those recordings. That is a violation of FERPA, and while the student would not be personally held liable, the institution could be cited if it got brought up. So if such a statement is clearly made to students and they violated it, it could also become part of the institution's code of student conduct, so something to think about there. Another consideration now for schools with respect to FERPA is the idea that faculty have student records at home and that those need to be protected as well. So that's something, gets back to what Jim and Ben were talking about earlier and really protecting those documents. HIPAA, again, we're running short on time, so I'm going to skip over HIPAA. It really doesn't really apply to higher ed institutions unless you've got a hospital or medical center on your campus and you've got non-student patients. So those records are subject to HIPAA. Otherwise, we don't need to worry about it. So as I've mentioned, there has been an uptick in cybersecurity breaches and findings and compliance audits from the department, and they are trying to clear up some of the overlaps in laws and obligations. So on that note, I will turn it back over to Jim to talk about the department's cyber initiative.
Well, thanks very much, Katie. So the U.S. Department of Education is looking at cybersecurity at schools, and it's a multi-pronged effort. But essentially, the idea is this, that we have certain information that institutions have that is subject to the Gramm-Leach-Bliley safeguards rule. There are certain information that may be subject to NIST 800-171, and others that may be subject to DFARS, we talked about earlier, if it's you're dealing with the Department of Defense, and potentially some HIPAA information. But there's nothing to kind of knit all of that together. And so you have large amounts of data that, at least on the security side, is either fairly unregulated or subject to regulations that may not be consistent. And so the idea has been, okay, we're looking at how can we cover some of this uncovered information, and is there a way to kind of standardize this across the enterprise? And that's what the Department of Education initiative has been looking at. So looking at what information is covered, what's not covered, and then to what extent can we have an across-the-board solution to all of this. And so there have been a lot of meetings. I mean, a lot of this has been meetings in DC at the department, and I've been involved with that. In December, the department sent out, unfortunately, just before the holidays, sent out a questionnaire to kind of determine if some of these existing standards that schools might be subject to might be a good baseline to apply in a broader context. So look, could we apply the safeguards rule outside of just financial aid? Is it feasible to apply that to other sensitive personal information that schools may have? Could we use something like the NIST 800-171 requirements in a broader context? And so there were questionnaires that were sent out about that to see how feasible it would be. And then those were sent back in January, and just as we were all preparing to act on that, everything hit. And I can tell you that things have been fairly quiet since then, because a lot of this was being done in person. The process has slowed down considerably. I would note, I mean, we're facing an election, and things can obviously always change policy-wise after an election. But historically, cybersecurity has been a concern on both sides of the aisle. And so I would note that the process might change somewhat if there is a change in administration, but I expect it to go on. And once things are freed up more, and after the election, I would expect this to pick up again. And since I am on this panel, if you have input, if you have thoughts about cybersecurity and what should go into this, let me know. Reach out to me. I'd love to talk to you about it to make sure that your voices are heard as to what shape this takes going forward. So with that, I mean, we're going to run a few minutes over, but I want to give it to my colleague, Luke Sosnicki, to talk a little bit about litigation risks that we've seen in higher education.
Thank you, Jim. So yeah, in addition to all of the regulatory issues and regulatory concerns that higher education institutions face, they are also not immune to the risk of private litigation if there's the subject of a data breach. And data breach litigation and private data breach litigation has been around for quite a while. And again, colleges and universities are not immune, and we've included 2 examples of some significant cases that cost some money ultimately to resolve. The cases historically, the types of private litigation have historically been brought under common law theories, including negligence and breach of contract, and a lot of the litigation focused on issues of standing and of damages. In other words, if a private individual's information was breached, how was that individual, and barring some sort of actual identity theft and use of that information leading to a financial loss, how is that individual then harmed, and what damages did the person suffer so as to be able to bring a private lawsuit to vindicate those rights. And I think one of the really important things for businesses and certainly higher education institutions as well is that might be changing. And California is, as perhaps expected, leading the charge on this with the CCPA. So I won't go into the details of all of the CCPA, including because we're running short on time, but the main point for purposes of this presentation is that it's privately actionable, and it's privately actionable for statutory damages. So in a lot of ways it kind of does away with some of the traditional defenses that businesses have had to data breach litigation, focusing on issues of standing and damages. The current version applies to, it has certain restrictions, other restrictions, but it applies to for-profit businesses only. So the statute itself, including the private right of action, doesn't apply, at least in its current form, to nonprofits. But that doesn't mean that nonprofits don't need to be aware of it and don't need to think about it, because even if a nonprofit institution itself might not be subject to the CCPA, it inevitably hires vendors and service providers that are. It is not limited, importantly, to California institutions. The institution must be doing, or the business must be doing business in California and collecting information from California consumers, but the statute itself is not limited in its application and scope to just California entities. And finally, I will just mention again a recent OFAC advisory that just came out a couple weeks ago, reminding businesses that paying ransomware, paying any money to folks on the OFAC list is prohibited and might be the subject of an enforcement action. So the advisory itself actually lists 4 specific types of malware that might be connected to foreign actors that are on the prohibited list, and a friendly reminder to institutions, including higher ed institutions receiving these types of ransomware, to please notify and work with your friendly regulator to minimize any risk that payments to some of these folks will result in an enforcement action by OFAC. So, Jim?
Yeah, thanks, Luke. I'd like to thank everyone for coming today. Just before you leave, one plug I'd like to make, in addition to the excellent higher education series that I'm pleased to be a part of today, is we will also be having a webinar on November 11th, kind of a post-election webinar by the cybersecurity group to talk about some of the effects of the election. Among other things, we'll discuss the California ballot initiative that would ramp up some of these requirements that Luke mentioned under the California Consumer Privacy Act, if that ballot initiative passes or not, as well as how other election issues may impact cybersecurity and privacy. With that, I'll pass it back to Aaron.
Thanks, Jim, and certainly thanks to Ben and Katie and Luke for the presentation today. Really appreciate it. I know there's just so much that institutions of higher ed are trying to contend with these days, and for those of you on the line, we certainly are sympathetic. We're very busy here on our side of the phone, so to speak, working with all of you, and know that there's just a tremendous amount to absorb, but this is certainly one of those areas where it is worth spending some time being deliberate and thoughtful, particularly for those of you who either are significantly in the online space or expanding and have those endpoints that may be reaching further and further out all the time. Here's contact information for our presenters today. I'll also comment, as I always do, on some resources. This webinar, all of our webinars, again, are available on demand, so if you want to go back and watch a second time or pass it along to a colleague, or you see one that you missed from a couple of weeks ago, by all means, please check them out. That's why they're there. We also highlight our blog, Regucation, sometimes pronounced Regucation. You can say it how you like, where we talk about various higher ed issues, and sometimes that includes cybersecurity and data security and things of that nature. I'll also plug, we had a Title IX training series that we did. It is all free. We did a six-part series that's sitting on YouTube. And if you're in charge of or know the folks at your institution who are trying to come into compliance with the new Title IX rule, please check out this training series. Again, it's all free, and we have some other materials that are available on that website as well. And then keep an eye out, you know, when we do our alerts and things of that nature, sometimes we announce these things on our blog as well. We will periodically produce free tools for the higher ed community. We do have an updated bar defense rule reporting guide that's coming your way. We had a Title IX compliance checklist, for example, that we put out earlier this year along with the training series. So we try to make sure our community knows about those types of things, but if you keep an eye on the blog, you will be more likely to see them. And then finally, we've got our disclaimer just reminding you that we are not your lawyers, or at least in the context of this webinar, we're not your lawyers or giving you legal advice. So with all of that being said, I will just once again thank everybody. I have one question I do want to pose, and if you have other questions out there and you'd like to offer up those questions, you can put them in the chat box. Here's my question, Jim, for you all, and then we'll see if any more come in. But, you know, if I'm an institution of higher education and I get, you know, and I have one of these events, and I receive some sort of ransomware or something along those lines. And I know we've talked around and about this a little bit before, but, you know, where do you think the first call ought to be when that comes in? I mean, is that to Ben? Is it to my lawyer? Am I getting my internal team together? Is it all of the above? I'm always very interested as a former in-house guy. What's the immediate first step or two that I should be taking to respond to something like this?
Well, I can answer that, I think, Aaron. I think you absolutely want to have prepared ahead of time what your plan is going to be. I think you need to know who, certainly internally, that you need to involve in scoping out, figuring out what happened in an incident, having those people ready, knowing exactly who you're going to call internally on an incident, and no more, no committees of 50 people. And then immediately upon convening that group, the next call, I think, should be to your legal counsel, whether that's internal or external. And then legal counsel quite well may want to bring in, and your internal IT people may also want to bring in outside resources like Ben. But in order to best protect under privilege what you may find with someone like Ben and SpearTip, you want to have them be engaged by the lawyers. Yeah, I think that's the general order of things.
That's great advice. And then one last question. You mentioned earlier, you're working with the department. There may be more activity coming up here. And you said if they want to provide you input for purposes of conveying that anonymously to the department, but at least getting to the department, they can reach out to you. Is that right? Phone, email, either one is okay?
Yes, absolutely. When we have these questions come out, there may be people here that I reached out to find out some of your thoughts, and I'd absolutely welcome hearing from others as we go through this process. What have you found that's worked? What have you found that's not worked? What are you afraid of? Because I think the department really does want to come up with something that best protects institutions, but we've said many times in these meetings, we don't want to reinvent the wheel. We don't want to come up with just another set of standards to layer onto the multiple ones that are already in place, but ultimately we want to make everyone more secure. And so I would absolutely welcome input from institutions, from individuals who have thoughts and concerns about coming up with cybersecurity standards.
Very good. Well, thank you again, Jim, and all our presenters today, and thanks everyone who tuned in. Don't forget, we've got these post-election webinars coming up, talking about cybersecurity, higher ed, and other issues. Keep a lookout for those. And otherwise, I'll just say on behalf of myself, the higher ed practice, everyone here at Thompson-Coburn, please be safe and be well, and we'll see you next time.